our series covering shoreline response. Today, Marcus is going to talk about shoreline response in the context of the tiered preparedness and response wheel. And if you have any questions throughout, you can pop them into the chat, and Marcus will have a chance to answer them at the end. And with that, I'll just pass it over down to Marcus.
Thanks, Mandy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. As Mandy said, my name's Marcus Russell. I come to OSRL having been an engineer in the Merchant Navy. That was 23 years ago. During that time since, I've had either, I don't know if you call it, the opportunity, good fortune or misfortune to be involved in a number of sort of like major spills, major incidents, and quite a few smaller incidents as well. So what I'm going to try and do today is draw on some of that experience and to articulate the shoreline response and the TPR wheel. So what I thought, hopefully if the IT will let me move my slides on. There we go, that should change. There's a little bit about myself, a picture of me. What I thought we'd do to start off with is just seeing as this is the Tiered Preparedness and Response series webinars, just spend a couple of minutes just to remind ourselves of what it is and what it isn't in terms of a model. I guess it goes without saying, first things is prevention is better than cure, so not to have a spill in the first place if you possibly can. But the model itself, the TPR, as it is now as a wheel, it's actually gone through, it's nothing new, it's quite an old concept really, but what it has gone through is several iterations and revisions, and the actual shape and format of it has changed quite a bit over certainly recent years. So in simple terms, it is a tool that identifies capability, and it will actually illustrate what that capability is. In terms of resources, it stipulates kind of what those, how much of those resources will be available, and it indicates where they will come from or the time frame in which they can actually come into a response arena. It's also worth pointing out at this stage, it's not used to categorise the size of a spill. So we're not saying it's, we're moving away from that quantitative model where it was, if it's 50 a spill above, let's say 50 cubes or 50 barrels triggers a certain level of response. It's not that at all. This is not the concept that the TPR wheel's intended for. The other thing that the model will actually help in determining an organisation's or a region's response capability is it may also help avoid any unnecessary duplication of resources or capability. So we've said that it's gone through a few iterations. In its early days, you might remember it was more like a matrix that was in its form. But what we've got now is a wheel, or a spoke, or wedges of a pie, whatever you'd like to call it. But following Macondo or Deepwater Horizon, there was a lot of work that was performed by industry to look at the capabilities that were needed, and they distilled that down to these core 15 capabilities that you can see here. Now, this isn't just for offshore. You can see in there's inland response, shoreline, which is what we're going to move on to in a minute, is at the bottom there, but there's also a lot of other capabilities. So this is all encompassing. If there's an organisation that's filling out the wheel and they don't need a certain capability, then it is just totally greyed out. But what the wheel will do is it will define those capabilities that are needed, and as we said, the capacity or the tier for each of those that's there. Another one of the big changes from the reforms that come through, or the revision that come through following Deepwater, was that it linked it to the incident management system, the IMS, which you can really see at the core there. And the idea there being that the IMS is what pulls everything together, that all of those capabilities, if they're needed, or how many of those capabilities are needed in an incident, the IMS is the system that holds it all together and makes sure that it's a coherent response. So that's probably enough of the background of TPR. We'll move in a little bit more about the shoreline side of things now. In a response, certainly a marine response, what you'll find is in the early stages there'll be a lot of activity at sea, whether that be chemical dispersants or whether that be offshore containment and recovery. That really is the emergency phase. Once it gets to a point where you've had a shoreline impact, there's kind of a transition. You're then going more from an emergency to a little bit more of a project. You know, you've worked hard to try and avoid a shoreline impact. Once it's happened, you then need to start thinking about how you'll manage that, and the pace of the response might change a little bit. In terms of objectives, what we're trying to achieve is trying to, at the end of the day, work with nature to accelerate any kind of natural recovery. Hydrocarbons, they're a natural product. They will biodegrade and they will break down naturally over time. So that's something that we're trying to maximise and try and work with, and we sort of like don't want to affect that process at all. The other thing what we'll be trying to look and do when planning a shoreline response is actually minimise the impact of the operations themselves. What we don't want to do is exacerbate a situation and make it worse and maybe create longer-lasting, longer-term damage than what the oil may have done itself. So we need to be controlled and measured in the response. And in doing that, there's obviously a lot of parameters that will need to be considered or that come into play. Those are the kind of questions that we'll sort of like start to ask. An example of some of the questions. So we're looking at the persistence of the oil. The way that we respond to a large gas oil spill would be different to a spill of a residual or a fuel oil. We would look at the environment that it's built in, the ambient conditions, you know, the temperatures, those kinds of things. It could be sometimes that it's actually better to leave it alone. You know, what would the consequences be of not actually having intrusive actions and response? There are obviously drawbacks with that, but there are some instances where it would be the right thing to do, and there may be some instances where politically that may not be acceptable. An example that springs to mind was the Erika tanker that sank off the coast of France. There was a high storms that was pushing oil up onto the beaches, onto cliff faces, which technically there was a strong argument for actually leaving alone. They were inaccessible. They weren't open to the public, or certainly not easily accessible to public. You know, aesthetically, it wasn't very pleasing, but over time that would have broken down, and like we said, natural processes would have occurred. But politically, that wasn't an option. That wasn't something that the French government or the responsible party was prepared to put up with. So in that case, it ended up with alpine climbers with pressure washer lances cleaning cliff faces. So it just depends on, there's a whole number of things that will issues that will come into play as to what is the correct actions. So those are the objectives. The next part is probably worth just looking at some of the realities. Certainly with larger incidents, you know, what makes shoreline response quite challenging, or can make it quite challenging. And one of those is basically logistics. You know, the spread of oil and the distances involved on a shoreline impact can be quite vast. You know, the Prestige, when you looked at the spill that happened there in 2002 off the coast of Spain, there was actually transboundary issues. It impacted the French coast, the Spanish and the Portuguese coastline. So logistically, it's a huge area to cover, and that creates problems in itself. To actually understand what's happening in the field, your surveys, what are the most heavily impacted areas, you know, how to ascertain the levels of contamination in those areas, what resources are needed, and then actually trying to command and control those resources in the field, and to get the feedback of how operations may be progressing. If you can imagine such large distances, you're going to need a lot of people. Now, whether that labour is trained or untrained, it may come from the military, it may be volunteers, but there's a degree of ownership that those individuals that are going to be performing the work on the shoreline, they will need to be able to do it safely. They may need the correct PPE. They would need welfare, they need water, they need feeding, there'll be other welfare facilities that will need. So logistics and supply chain to keep that operating it does become quite large, quite quickly as well. I've touched on volunteers. Again, a lot of the intentions are they're well intended, but they do need management, and they do need to make sure, as a responsible party, we need to make sure that they're actually cared for and they're not putting themselves at harm or in danger, or actually maybe doing more harm than good in the cleanup itself. Another part of shoreline cleanup, all the time you're at sea, it's quite distant. You're not going to be easily accessible to that area unless you've got a helicopter or a boat. But once it comes ashore, it may mean that public amenity beaches need to be closed, or certainly if they're not closed, then the public can come onto work areas and they can get quite close and personal with the work that's going on the shoreline, so they can actually start then to form maybe their own opinion, which sort of is not always technically true, or maybe certainly with social media, you may not want some of those messages being pushed out. And then when you bundle all of those things together, you put them together financially, it can be quite costly. It's not going to be a cheap operation to put all that in place. So that's just to give a flavour of some of the challenges and the realities of a shoreline operation. But there are systematic ways that we try to work, and one of those really, quite often it gets overlooked, but if we've got good surveillance, if we know which way the oil is moving, if we've done our modelling, we may know where natural collection areas may form. One of the things we can do is a pre-clean. So if those areas where there's flotsam and jetsam that may collect, that could be pushed up above the high water mark so that it doesn't become contaminated and doesn't then have to be dealt with as hazardous waste. So it can help keep that contamination level down. Once oil has come ashore, there's basically 3 phases to the cleanup itself. One is the removal of bulk oil, one is the removal of stranded oil, and then finally is what we call the final polish, which is the removal of stains and lower volumes of hydrocarbon that may remain. It's important not to try and jump between each of the phases too quickly. It's a natural tendency that you want to get in. We want to clean it up as quickly as possible. But just depending on the status of the spill, it could mean that you're trying to jump from one to the other too soon. So if it's an ongoing release, it may be that you go through all 3 stages, you sign one site off, and then if there's still oil at sea or there's still oil being released, it may be that you then get pushed back to a stage 1 or a stage 2, which is demoralising for a workforce. So it's important that the steps are followed and it's done methodically. Again, one example that I know from experience with the Erica was where we done exactly that. There was a lot of pressure to sign sites off to sort of demonstrate progress and to prove that the work was being successful. But there was unknown volumes of oil still at sea or submerged oil. So one of the sites that we had worked was cleaned. It was signed off. It was considered back to its normal state. Only for work to stop over an Easter period, during which there was particularly high seas and storms that then remobilised the submerged oil and pushed it back onto this natural collection area. Again, it creates problems in terms of morale for cleanup crews. The actual process itself is that we said it's working systematically, working through each of the phases in a controlled manner. But the general process is that we've already talked about surveys, or the importance of surveys and having that picture of what's happening in the field. So you can identify the areas that are most heavily impacted, where to assign the resources. So you have your surveys, you will then plan your cleanup activities, making sure that your logistics are resupplying operations so that they can perform the day-to-day activities. They report back on recovery rates and site progress. And at which point, once you achieve a certain threshold, you move on to the next phase and repeat the process of surveys, planning, and conducting operations. The importance of, there's a small box at the bottom there, termination for endpoint of activities. That really can be quite a contentious issue. the question used to be how clean is clean, and if there isn't background data, then that can become quite contentious. But the whole idea is that it's not to over clean or to sterilize a particular area, but it's to make sure that it gets back to its natural condition. So it needs to have the involvement of quite a few parties before you get to that point of termination. But when we do feel that we get there, it's a collective agreement and it's signed off to say that is its work has been completed. What we'll do now is just go through a little bit on each of those phases, each of those stages. So the first one that we said there is the bulk oil. This may be where you're actually getting waves of black oil that's coming ashore. It's preferable if waste can be recovered as liquid, then it may be possible for that to be sent away for reprocessing. It may be easier to actually dispose of in that respect. But generally it will require specialist equipment. That's where you need your booms, your skimmers, your pumps, storage tanks, that kind of those kinds of resources to be able to capture that liquid waste. And again, some of the impurities, small bits of flotsam, jetsam, and seawater, that may actually prevent some of that liquid oil actually from being reprocessed or reintroduced into the processing facility. So it's not a guaranteed, but if liquid waste, if we can get liquid waste, we'll prefer that much over solid waste. There can still be high volumes of oil that are stranded on the shoreline. And it depends on what shoreline type that it is. You can see here on the picture, large, wide sandy beaches, which are probably preferable, certainly more straightforward in terms of cleaning. The kit that we can use for that is low tech. You can see JCBs, front end loaders, general heavy plant, and they can have the ability to clear large areas over relatively short periods of time, but they can also create large volumes of waste. If they're removing too much sediment with the oil, quite quickly that waste volume can increase, and it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. So for that reason, it may be low tech and it may recover or clean areas quickly, but it still needs careful management. And again, just to prove the point, if you look at the picture on the screen, you can see there's quite a few track marks and tyre marks that have gone up and down the beach. Obviously, the JCB operator is not being well supervised, and you can see that he's obviously driving over the oil, driving the oil into the sand and making a problem for further down the road. So it still needs to be carefully monitored. Again, certainly, if sediment removal is a problem, it may mean that manual recovery is an option. It's a much lower recovery rate. It means that you will need a lot more labour. Again, that will need more supervision, remembering your command of control. And they will also need their logistics and their support, PPE, things like that. So this is a trade-off, but it may be particularly useful in areas where a shoreline is particularly sensitive and we don't want to take away any more sediments than is absolutely necessary. So those are kind of the options for phase one removal of bulk oil. For stranded oil that's obviously not in large volumes, what we can try to do, again, to minimise waste is attempt to remobilise it. It will be dependent on oil type, shoreline type, ambient temperatures. Again, it's not a silver bullet, but it is an option in the right circumstances. So high volume, low pressure flushing of shorelines, basically trying to remobilise oil that is stranded, push it back into the tidal zone where it can be contained with using boom and recovered using skimmers. Again, it reduces the amount of waste and it gives us that liquid waste or that liquid product that we can then send away for reprocessing. So flushing is one option. If it's buried, another technique that we may be able to use is actually to flush it out with lances. Again, using the lance, we can actually pump water to bring the oil to the surface where it can be contained in a boom for recovery. or an alternative may actually be that we use manual labour to remove the clean sediment and to dig out areas of contamination. Again, not suitable for large areas, but and it's very labour intensive, but again, it needs careful consideration where it may or may not be suitable. There's also the option for surf washing. This may be for lower levels of contamination on sediments such as pebbles and cobbles, where removing large volumes is not desirable. So we can use the natural energy from the surf by day after day pushing the sediments into the surf zone, where the natural cleaning process or the wave action will gradually remove the contamination from the sediments and leave it open for bioremediation. Again, these are low volumes of oil concentration. And then finally, the final polish. Again, there are different options that are available. There's not a silver bullet, but it may mean that if there's large volumes of sand that have low levels of contamination, they can be processed on site or in situ, pass through the cleaning process, and then deposited back on the beach, directly onto the beach. It could be in the middle picture there, that's from the Tasman Spirit, where there was high levels of microbial activity in the seawater anyway, and the decision was taken to plough or till the beach to oxygenate on a low tide, and as the tide come in with the microbes, the hydrocarbon was exposed, the oxygen was there, and it would actually accelerate that bioremediation process. Or on rocky shorelines, it may mean that pressure washing is an option. Again, being careful not to use steam cleaning. This is maybe warm water, so as not to sterilise and totally sterilise an area. But again, this is the importance of selecting the right method for the right circumstances. What I'm trying to do with this slide is link it back to the TPR. So, you know, tiered preparedness, what may it look like? You know, I've shown a lot of pictures of large scale incidents, but more often than not, that's not the case. In the real world, what we have for tier 1, quite often it may just be a shipping container with lots of hand tools. It may be that there's a specialist, a small level of specialist equipment, such as skimmers, booms, shoreline booms, temporary storage tanks, or it may actually be that I think my camera's moved. It may actually be that there's a equipment package, a tier 1 equipment package that's hired in just for the short-term duration of an operation. Tier 2, again, bearing in mind this is risk-based, so if it's an operation that's in a particularly remote area, the tier 2 capability of a particular operator or region may have to be enhanced. So that could be an enhanced tier 1. It could be that there are commercial operators. That's moved again. It could be that there are commercial operators that can be brought in, or it could even be a mutual aid agreement. So there's different options for tier 2. And then finally, for tier 3, there's organisations such as OSRL that will keep the large-scale resources that are able to be mobilised internationally or nationally at short notice. So again, it just depends on what activities are being carried out and what the shoreline types are, the remoteness, the risk, and all those factors that will play into what the TPR wheel may actually look like. We've said that there's been various evolutions, and again, one of the key ones was deep water horizon. Another thing that actually came out of that was another piece of guidance, and that is the evolution of the Shoreline Response Programme. Obviously, that was a larger scale incident, and the systems that were in place were intended for long-term planning and coordination of operations, but they evolved as the spill evolved, but it was a very effective way of managing such an incident. And basically what it done was it integrated the shoreline cleanup into the IMS. And the way that worked is it was actually bridged two areas, and that was the planning section where all the surveys or the feedback from surveys was being received. The shoreline treatment recommendations were being drawn up, and then they were actually being passed to operations. And what we were finding is there was a little bit of a breakdown between what was the good intentions in the command post where the STRs were being drawn up and the realistic or the realism of operations in the field. There was a little bit of a breakdown. So what we actually found was that there was a position for what we called SCAT, Ops Liaison. So SCAT is your shoreline cleanup assessment techniques. Obviously, operations is where the work's being done. Excuse me. But what we were doing is going out into the field and making sure that the guys in the operations had the correct STR for that zone. They had the correct equipment and resources available to them, and that they also understood what the STR meant so that the work could actually be conducted in the way that was intended. But this was something that, like I say, it was a large-scale spill, and it was something that evolved over a period of time. But that has now been formalised. So like a lot of the good practice guides, that is actually available on the IPECA website, or if you go to the GI WACAF or the Osprey, the other GI initiative websites, there's a full library of the good practice guides and guidance. So I'll direct you there if you wasn't already aware of that. I think, Mandy, the next slide is the end. Excuse me, my voice is going now. But
well done.
Thanks. I don't know if there's any questions.
There haven't been any come in, but if anyone has any questions, you can just type them into the Q&A box. If you're joining by mobile, you'll just kind of have to pull that down on the top of the screen, and you'll see a little Q&A chat bubble. If you're on your laptop, it's a Q&A at the top navigation. Our next series session in the series will be on July 6th, where Dave Rouse will be discussing protection of sensitive resources. So now that you're on the list and registered for this seminar series, you'll receive a link to join that, and you'll also receive a recording of this seminar and some of the helpful documents that Marcus referenced in his presentation. So I'll just give it another minute and see if we do get any questions from the audience. And if not, you can always send them to Marcus. We do have one. Can you use some kind of chemical or solvent during the low pressure flushing, is the question, Marcus.
It's a good question. Some dispersants have been approved for shoreline use, but I think it's something that have to be used very cautiously if it was a dispersant. Again, in my experience, there have been examples of products that have been used on the shoreline for cleaning, certainly more things like bedrock and rock faces and cliff faces. Yes, there have been products that have been used. It's certainly something I would be cautious about. If I was on the beach myself, I'd be cautious about and probably look to take guidance from other sources before using it wide scale. Yeah, so in the answer to the question, yes, there are some. Do we advocate their use regularly? I personally haven't used them that often, and it's something I would probably be cautious of, but it may be something that regulators would have a list of what is approved and what may not be used on the shoreline. But yeah, it's a good question.
So I don't know that we don't have any other questions at the moment, but again, if anyone had anything that they wanted to ask Marcus about, you can send him an email.
Yeah. Feel free.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And again, don't forget to join us on Wednesday, July 6th at 2 o'clock for the protection of sensitive resources.